how long can an army's soldiers endure being sleep-deprived on the front lines of the battlefield because of hunger, thirst, and lack of shelter? Even staying awake for 24 hours brings with it problems such as drowsiness, irritability, poor concentration, fatigue, increased risk of mistakes or accidents, and food cravings. Longer periods of insomnia can lead to problems as big as delirium. The soldiers of the Russian army often face insomnia problems as they live in unfavorable conditions on the Ukrainian front lines. In addition, the problems experienced in finding soldiers in the Russian army are already present, and they can extend the duty and watch time of the Russian soldiers currently on the territory of Ukraine. All this brings up the concept of insomnia, which is one of the biggest problems for a person. So how big of a problem can this insomnia problem cause for the Russian soldiers? In this video, we'll talk to you about an unbelievable situation caused by insomnia that you may not have encountered before. Let's examine together this critical situation where even a single mistake affects the fate of the war with the exacerbation of clashes in Ukraine. The violence of the war has increased so much that the soldiers of both sides almost do not even have time to breathe, let alone sleep. But no matter how hard the war goes, the soldiers in the Russian and Ukrainian armies need rest due to their heavy and difficult tempo. This need has been used by the Russian soldiers at a very wrong time in recent days. Recently, a platoon of Russian soldiers on the Ukrainian front lines fell asleep in the trenches, succumbing to exhaustion. What seemed innocuous at first turned into one of the biggest mistakes made in the war. As time passed, because the Ukrainian forces had already surrounded the trench line where the Russians fell asleep, the real nightmare began. Rather than sleep, when the Ukrainian troops, after checking the area where the Russian soldiers were sleeping, infiltrated into this area. When the Russian soldiers woke up from their sleep, they came face to face with the barrels of the rifles pointed at them by the Ukrainian forces. The nightmare for the Russians began at this very moment. Ukrainian forces warned Russian soldiers to surrender immediately, left with no other choice. The Russian troops helplessly surrendered to the Ukrainian forces. A platoon of Russian soldiers not only lost control of this area, but also made the mistake of their lives sleeping in the trench lines. On the other hand, these striking moments were recorded on camera, second by second. The recorded historical footage was released by the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, named after the Black Zaporozhians, a formation of the Ukrainian ground forces. It's estimated that the Ukrainian soldiers who carried out the operation were also from this brigade. In fact, such situations occur frequently on the front lines in Ukraine, but we have yet to encounter such a clear and striking image. In fact, such mistakes are unforgivable on the battlefield. A soldier sleeping at the front either dies or surrenders, especially when the clashes of the war in Ukraine have flared up. So much negatives, such as the surrender of Russian soldiers due to reasons such as falling asleep, are very beneficial for Ukraine. Such negative situations can lead the Russians to failure on the Ukrainian front lines even more. Until now, Russian soldiers are trying to save their lives by surrendering either as a result of the I Want to Live project or as a result of conflicts or in such strange situations. It's estimated that more than 22,000 Russian soldiers have surrendered to date. But was the Russian army's only failure to be captured by dormant Ukrainian forces? Of course, no, because nowadays the Russian army has much bigger problems. General Christopher Cavoli, the commander of the US forces in Europe, confirmed that the Russian army is facing major problems during the disastrous invasion of Ukraine. Speaking at the Lennart Meri conference in Tallinn, Estonia, Cavoli urged Western observers not to jump to conclusions based on repeated combat failures of Russian ground forces in Ukraine. The U.S. general stated that the disappearance of the Russian army in Ukraine is an issue that needs to be examined very closely. Russia's ground forces were eroded to a great extent and they faced great problems. Russian troops lost a lot of people. They lost a lot of equipment. The Russian Air Force lost less than 100 fighters and bombers. So Mr. Kavoli was quite right. The Russians were literally melting away on the territory of Ukraine. But the extent of the Russian personnel losses in Ukraine remains unclear. Kiev claims to have purged nearly 200,000 Russian soldiers since the start of the full-scale invasion on February 24, 2020. To the Ukrainian estimate generally fits with an American estimate of about 200,000 Russian soldiers killed and wounded in the same time period. European officials reported that elite Russian troops, including those deployed along NATO borders, suffered between 30 and 40% casualties. Some such units are being rebuilt with the help of Russian partial mobilization, but the loss of experienced junior officers and professional contract troops will likely mean that these units will operate at lower power and at a generally lower capacity. On the other hand, the demands of the war forced Moscow to send troops again from the border areas to Ukraine. Kavali reported that it was unclear how long it would take for Russia to return to pre-war strength, but the relative health of the Kremlin's air and naval armaments meant there was an expanded danger of war. However, while the Russian army still has the opportunity to recover, the latest situations in the eastern front lines of Ukraine do not seem to allow this. In particular, the Bakhmut front line stands out as the most important front line that stopped and regressed the Russian army in the fortress of war. The tension does not decrease in any way. Ukrainians made critical statements for the city for the last time. Ukraine's Ministry of Defense reports that it has regained ground in Bakhmut, a rare advance after months of crushing Russian gains in Bakhmut. Kiev claimed that its forces advanced 2 kilometers in a week. Against these statements, the Russian side claimed that the troops were regrouping in this region. On the other hand, Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Anna Malyar announced in a post that she shared on Telegram that Russia suffered significant troop losses as Ukraine gained 2 kilometers without losing any positions. The Russian Ministry of Defense, on the other hand, announced that the troops of the Russian Southern Group took a better defensive position in the Maly-Olenivka region, taking into account the favorable conditions of the Markiivka Reservoir. But the head of Russia's Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, said that the situation the Ministry of Defense was talking about unfortunately was not regrouping but fleeing. Meanwhile, Russian military bloggers reported that Ukraine was advancing or troop movements in various areas. All of this signaled a change of momentum in Bakhmut. But will the momentum of the war stay in Ukraine? This is one of the questions that everyone is wondering. In fact, if military aid to the Ukrainian army continues, there's no reason why the Ukrainians should not take advantage of the war. Of course, in this process, we should also consider that the Russians made mistakes on the Ukrainian front lines due to sleepiness, hunger, and other negative situations we mentioned. In addition, we should add the lack of military ammunition on top of these negatives in the Russian army, because the Ukrainian armed forces is constantly renewing its inventory with US-made Patriot air defense systems, armored combat vehicles such as the French AMX-10RC, and war gods such as Turkish-made Kirpi and Cobra armored vehicles. The Russian army, on the other hand, is getting more and more difficult in terms of military resources. As you know, Russian leader Vladimir Putin is making serious efforts to eliminate this problem. But Putin doesn't have as many friends as Ukrainian leader Zelensky. And if the war continues like this, perhaps Putin will have to surrender to Kiev, just like the Russian soldiers caught in their sleep. The breaking point of the Ukrainian war has been experiencing a series of death spirals in recent days. Ground and naval forces of the Russian army no longer feel safe on the peninsula, which has been the target of Ukrainian attacks for the last 2 months. Thousands of Russians fleeing Crimea after the attack by Ukraine also made the Kremlin think brooding. In fact, at the beginning of the process, the Ukrainian armed forces was leading the Kherson counter-offensive at the time of this attack. It was stated in a statement made by the United States that the Ukrainian armed forces guaranteed that the US would not use weapons against Russian soil. However, US senior officials declared that Crimea is Ukrainian territory and there are no restrictions on the firing of US weapons into Crimea. Immediately after this statement, attacks began, one after another. The Ukrainian armed forces carried out accurate attacks on many critical targets, especially in Sevastopol, Russia's largest port in the Black Sea. Especially with the attacks of kamikaze drone armies, Crimea began to turn into a grave for the Russian army. In the latest report, Nizhnogorsky in western Crimea was attacked by kamikaze drones. Video footage of the battle between Russian air defense systems and Ukrainian drones was filmed by local residents. Initially, local Telegram channels reported that an explosion occurred at Cape Valent. However, the Kremlin shared the information that the crime was a gas cylinder explosion, although Ukrainian information sources presented it as a drone attack. Later, it was learned that the work of air defense systems and explosions were recorded in the west of the peninsula. In other words, the Kremlin seems to be trying to surprise the target with its new statements. In the video footage taken by the locals, you can see how the air defense systems are working intensely just a few hundred meters away after one of the accurate shots of the Russian air defense system. The drone was shot down a moment later. However, a powerful explosion was observed, which turned out to be the result of undermining the drone's warhead. It is claimed that the destruction and loss of life were prevented as a result of another attack on Crimea. At the same time, the Russian Defense Ministry could not determine exactly which target the drone or several kamikaze planes were trying to attack, since the information about their number is still very unclear. This dawn attack, which took place just before Russia declared a ceasefire on January 5th, was the sixth explosion in Crimea. Within a week, drone armies of the Ukrainian armed forces began targeting Russian positions and military installations in Crimea every day. One day before the attack in Nizhnogorsky, explosions occurred near the Russian Belbek military airfield in Crimea. In addition, Sarkoy was attacked twice. The volume of attacks on Crimean areas increased as the Ukrainian armed forces liberated areas further south in November, including the strategic port city of Kherson, about 125 miles north of the annexed land mass in the Black Sea. On New Year's Day, to the eastern region of Crimea was shaken by unexplained explosions in Ukraine's latest attack on the annexed region. According to the footage, the air defense struggled in the early hours to intercept what appeared to be missiles in Nizhnogorsky region of Crimea. A media outlet in Eastern Europe claimed that multiple Ukrainian missiles hit targets in Crimea. The contrast in the two reports about the same attack pushed us to examine the footage better. When we examine the images more carefully, it is clearly seen that these explosions are a clear kamikaze drone attack. The attack on Nizhnogorsky actually had a very critical strategic meaning. The attack on military bases in the region, which is very close to the entrance strait of Crimea, shows all of us the attack plan. In Kiev's mind, the Ukrainian armed forces are trying to break through the Russian defense in Crimea with similar attacks. However, the Crimean offensive of the Ukrainian armed forces will be much more difficult than any other offensive, because it should not be forgotten that Crimea has been under Russian control for about 8 years. Frankly, it's not Crimea. Kherson, it occupies a different place in the war, and many Western allies have serious concerns about escalation over Crimea. Vladimir Putin could lose in Kherson or anywhere in Ukraine and accept his losses. He could even lose and politically control Donbass, a part of eastern Ukraine that Russia has occupied since 2014. but Putin sees losing Crimea and surviving as president absolutely irreconcilable. He will do his best to keep Crimea in his hands. This can be a difficult order. Ukraine has already demonstrated the vulnerability of Crimea with Russia's attacks on the Black Sea Fleet and its attacks on the bridge over the Kerch Strait, which connects Russia with Crimea. It should continue to exert military pressure on the Crimea and advance in the south, in Kherson region. For now, however, it would be wise to squeeze and isolate Russian troops into the Crimea without attempting to reconquer the peninsula. This strategy will give Kiev a strong position in future negotiations with Russia and will likely persuade the Kremlin to enter such negotiations seriously. This will help maintain unity among Ukraine's Western partners who are cornered about escalation risks. More urgently, Ukraine may seek to break the land bridge to Crimea by separating Russia's forces in the south from those in the east and regaining access to the Sea of Azov. This attack has been carried out before, and the bridge became unusable for a while in the Kerch Bridge attack, which is thought to have been carried out by the Ukrainian partisan repair. Work on the bridge is still ongoing. However, the destruction of the Kerch Bridge will completely sever the peninsula's connection with Russia. Ukraine's fear of a possible Crimean attack could put the Kremlin on red alert at any moment. Putin's fears about the Crimea are increasing after the latest intelligence reports reached the Kremlin on this issue. Because the vulnerability of Crimea is a reality. The fact that Crimea has been subjected to more than 10 attacks in the last month shows not only the Kremlin, but also us how inadequate the defense systems in the region are. As we mentioned at the beginning, 6 of these attacks occurred in the last week. Russian military commanders are also increasingly concerned about Crimea's vulnerability to Ukrainian attacks. Military bases on the peninsula have previously been used to launch drone attacks on Ukrainian cities. However, in the last attacks, UAVs were deployed from the Krasnodar region of Russia. Changing the launch site is likely due to Russian concerns about the vulnerability of Crimea, but it also seems appropriate for resupply from Astrakhan, the possible destination of the weapons in Russia. War experts predict that the Ukrainian army could take control of the occupied Crimean peninsula by August 2023. This is a very serious claim because next February bears the expectation that the first break in the war will take place. A much more difficult process will await both armies. The latest satellite images of Russian-occupied Crimea show airfields, air defense zones, and ships, which defense experts say could rank as prime targets for the Ukrainian military as it seeks to weaken its forces and recapture captured territory. Crimea's importance as a launching pad for Russia's attacks on mainland Ukraine increased after Russian forces withdrew from the city of Kherson, the only regional capital they had captured since Moscow launched a large-scale invasion in February a month ago. Russian forces have suffered numerous setbacks since the invasion. Satellite images show that out of 10 active military airfields in Crimea by mid-November, the airspace in St. Croix has become the main logistics center for Russian operations in southern Ukraine. It also serves as a base for attack helicopters. For this reason, we can say that Tsarskoye is now #1 among the top 5 targets for Ukrainian attacks. Even if Putin does not want to fully believe that the Crimean attack of the Ukrainian armed forces will still take place, this attack is very close to him. And if Crimea falls, Putin will have to abdicate his throne in the Kremlin. For this reason, it can be expected that the biggest battle of the war will take place in this region. There was a major shift in fighting. If previously the area to the north of Bakhmut was more or less dormant, then over the last week, the Russians started a series of intense fights in this region as well. And here is why. Initially, the Russians have been put in a lot of effort into developing their offensive operation to the south of Bakhmut. However, they did not pick this direction to exploit some favorable conditions. In fact, attacking it from the south is the most time and resource-consuming way of taking Bakhmut by attacking it from the south. The Russians cannot limit Ukrainian supplies as all the main roads are to the northwest of Bakhmut, and out of reach. Encircling Bakhmut from the southwest is a suicide operation because they will be shot in the back from Yar and Konstantinovka. So storming Bakhmut from the south only means expending manpower by sending them to storm echelon defenses. The best way to storm Bakhmut is to storm it from the north. By taking the northern part of Bakhmut, all supplies will be cut and the city will be in the operational encirclement. The Russians obviously already tried it, but they encountered one big problem. They were basically being shot in the back from Soledar. So to take Bakhmut with minimum losses, the Russians first need to establish control over Soledar. But Soledar is an industrial town with a lot of infrastructures that can be fortified and used for defense purposes. Ukrainians also managed to force the Russians to play by their rules, which is why the Russians did not manage to advance even an inch since summer. The best way to storm Soledar is from the northern ground, not eastern. And that is why the Russians have been devoting a lot of resources lately to take control over the northern ground. Now the Ukrainians have been holding the Yakovlivka-Bilo-Horivka-Berestovo line for half a year. The Ukrainians also liberated Spirin last month, which deteriorated Russian tactical positions even more as of now. The Russians are controlling Berestovo, and this is where they have been launching a lot of assaults over the last several days. And this is not good news because if we look at the topographic map, we can see that Berestovo is located on the highlands almost 100 meters above the Ukrainians in Bilo-Horivka. Nonetheless, the topography is not everything. If you look at the 3D map, we can see that the Ukrainians established their defenses along the railways, which are also covered with a lot of trees. That is why the Ukrainians managed to hold the defense for such a long period of time here. This is also the reason why the Russians still conducted most of their attacks from Vasilivka, because this way they could avoid forest fights. Unfortunately, the latest reports suggest that the Russians managed to get a toehold of the village. Such development shifted the fights a little bit back. Now the Ukrainians are supplying and launching their attacks from Vasily, and the Russians are trying to counter these attacks from Berestovo. The situation here is very inconvenient for both sides, but even though locally it did not change too much, such a small shift of the front line unfortunately cost a lot for the Ukrainians. As the front line shifted a little bit back, the Russians gained more room for maneuver, which made it easier for them to storm Yakovlivka. If we go back to the topographic map, we can see that Yakovlivka is the only barrier that prevents the Russians from gaining the high ground to the north of Solidarity. By gaining access to this ground, the situation in Soledar may start to deteriorate quickly, and some sources started to suggest that Yakovlivka fell. This is very fresh news, and they are coming from the Russian side, so take it with a grain of salt. But the main idea is still the same. These three tiny villages that form a defense triangle is the only thing that is holding Soledar, and Soledar is the only thing that is holding Bakhmut. So far the Ukrainians managed to hold this line, and the front line shifted back and forth previously as well, which strongly indicates that this defense line will not collapse easily.